The topic for today is colonialism and resistance in Alaska, the first 230 years. And I'm marking that time period of 230 years very deliberately because 1741 is arguably the first year of sort of Russian/European colonialism in Alaska. And then 1971 is the year that the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed, kind of bringing us into the modern era of the relationship between Alaska Native groups and the federal and state government. And so that's a very intentionally chosen time period. Now, as I talk about colonialism, I want to do this topic justice because colonialism is a topic that is complex, it's a topic that is lengthy, it is a topic that I do not want to oversimplify. It is a topic that I want to honor the pain that is associated with that and the dramatic way in which it affected Native communities and is affecting Native communities. As I've argued before, the colonial pasts produce the colonial present and the colonial presence. So with that in mind, let's jump into this. Again, you really can't understand the contemporary state of Alaska Native peoples without understanding colonialism. Much of this course, we will talk about the beautiful lifeways and traditions of different Alaska Native peoples, but we also need to be able to understand the historical context they find themselves in. And to talk about that, we have to discuss a topic that is less beautiful, namely the topic of colonialism. First, it's useful to know what the word colonialism means. Colonialism can be thought of as the control of an indigenous people and their land. And we sometimes distinguish between different types of colonialism, such as, for example, wow, I didn't actually finish my sentence down here. My apologies for that. Resource colonialism, which means colonialism where a resource is extracted. Let's just fix that right now. There we go. So, colonialism where resources extracted. So, for example, in the case of the Navajo Nation, where I do a lot of my field research, the uranium mines that were set up, hundreds of uranium mines set up within the Navajo Nation, even though it was still primarily Navajo populations, it was being used as a resource colony, right, where uranium was being extracted from, timber, oil and gas, different things. Settler colonialism is colonialism where the colonizing population actually goes in and controls and occupies the space. If not replacing the indigenous population, certainly coming to a point where they are the more powerful population within that same space. So resource colonialism and settler colonialism can be separate things. You sometimes have areas that a nation, an empire controls that it's extracting resources from. It's still primarily indigenous, but they're controlling it and extracting resources from it. And then you also have cases where an empire takes over a piece of land and then puts people, their own people, so to speak, in that land. And the United States, the colonialism in the United States has often taken on both of these characteristics, sometimes emphasizing more of one or the other. And you might ask yourself which better characterizes Alaska. You might even pause the video and kind of answer. As you probably gathered from the reading, early colonialism in Alaska was very much more resource colonialism. The Russian population at any given time during the Russian period never, as far as we can tell from the historical records, never really got much higher than 700, which admittedly at the time was larger than that would seem now, given the population density, but still 700 is not that much. And many of these people were not sort of setting up shop to be there forever, but were there to engage in the business of trading in and extracting furs, right? So to a great degree, during the Russian period, a lot of that was resource colonialism, extracting furs. It really doesn't become, there are some colonies set up, but really kind of full-on settler colonialism where you get large-scale Euro-Americans into the area and displacement of native populations as a result really doesn't get started in full until the early 20th century, as we'll talk about in a bit. When we think about colonialism, at its core, colonialism is about control. It's usually motivated by a drive for resources. When you think about why, for example, Britain spread into the area we now think of as the United States and Canada, when you think about why Spain spread into the area and invaded the areas that we now think of as South America and Central America, when you think of why Portugal did that, when you think about why Germany was establishing colonies within Africa. Anytime we think about that, we're talking about control, and usually control for a purpose, which is resources. Sometimes resources, by which I mean things like gold or silver, and sometimes resources in the sense of land, space, wherein populations from the empire can be put. And or sometimes control and subjugation for the purposes of things such as slavery, as um, you can see in many of what the British colonizers were doing. But the key theme across all of that really is control, right? For colonialism to extract resources, to extract people, very tragically, to extract new territory, has to be able to control the land and control the people. So this typically means that when an empire moves into an area, they will engage in one of or several of the following activities. The most obvious, taking of land. Closely related, depopulation, right? Colonialism is very often violent. Typically is violent as far as drastically reducing or at least somewhat reducing the native population. What might be less obvious than taking land and destroying population is two other modalities of colonialism, one of which is limitation of sovereignty. So, for example, if you look at the United States, the lower 48, Native American nations were recognized even during sort of the horrible things that were experienced in the 1700s and early 1800s. They were still recognized under U.S. law as truly sovereign separate nations that had treaty relationships with the U.S. government. It was in sort of the 1820s, 1830s that you had what was called the Marshall Doctrine from the Supreme Court, which essentially held that the tribal governments were inferior to the U.S. government in their sovereignty. And that there's several laws after that that kind of further paved the way for that, all of which were kind of in contrary to both international law and the U.S.'s own treaties. But the point of that was for there to be true control, the U.S. sort of over time chipped away at native sovereignty down in the lower 48. And we see some of those same things happening up here in Alaska, as we'll talk about as this goes on. And then another aspect of colonialism is assimilation of native culture. So if the point is control, you don't necessarily, then empire to have control doesn't necessarily always have to remove a population. If it can instead get a population to act like the subjects of the empire, right? If they can get them to be part of the empire, so to speak, to pledge allegiance to the empire, or at the very least, not pledge active resistance to the empire. And in that regards, Alaska, as is also the case with Canada and much of the lower 48, has a long and painful history, for example, of residential and boarding schools, which were used throughout the American period to forcefully inculcate a very specific types of cultural practices in Native people. Native children would be brought into these schools and forced not to speak their native language, be shamed, and sometimes physically abused to not speak their native language. Some have argued that missionization or conversion of indigenous populations to Christianity could be seen as a way in which assimilation occurs. Although, as the Boris and Leggett reading points out, a lot of times in Alaska, that Christianity became sort of highly indigenized. But the point is that part of how empire works, part of how colonialism works, is attempting to assimilate native cultures in and making them act like other people that are part of the empire so that things can be controlled. And there's not supposed to be sort of rival sovereignties and rival cultures. And again, sort of the motivations here of colonialism, broadly speaking, is control of resources. That's sort of talking about colonialism big picture. I do think in Alaska there's some interesting may be the wrong word, challenging things that sort of further complicated how colonialism worked in Alaska. So Alaska was, again, largely a resource colony rather than a settler colony for Russia, with some exceptions, but still largely unoccupied within the Russian period. And then even within the American period remained somewhat unoccupied until gold was discovered, whaling really got going, and then later oil, at which point oil definitely drove it into statehood. During this time, though, that means that the displacement of a lot of Alaska, the effects on a lot of Alaska Native communities were felt most intensely during the 20th century, which is later than a lot of the native tribes in the lower 48. And also that kind of structures how these things went down. So during the 1700s, early 1800s, the US was in the practice of creating treaties with native tribes that led to the reservation system and eventually to the tribal government system as we understand it in the lower 48. By the time Alaskan populations were booming in the early 20th century, the treaty making period was effectively over. So a very different sort of landscape. In some ways worse, in some ways better from a native perspective. Probably in more ways worse, but in some ways better. There's also these kind of discourses within Alaska that affected how colonialism went down. So there's this sort of discourse that you see pop up a lot when you look at the history of Alaska as this place that was abundant in resources and opportunity. So a big motivation for colonialism to first happen was that there was, these sort of abundant populations of sea otters and things that could drive the fur trade after fur resources had been sort of demolished in Siberia during Russian expansion. And then during the American period, of course, oil, right? The oil beam, the oil boom, the Yukon / Klondike gold boom, right? These booms of resources. So Alaska is resource, Alaska is opportunity, which indeed, if you talk to a lot of Alaskans today, that's sort of how we often think about Alaska, right? This frontier of endless possibilities. At the same time, you also get this kind of rival discourse that pops up a lot in the historical records, where some people involved in the colonizing process saw Alaska as very barren and very empty and almost not worthy of control. So you'll see both kind of come into play, and these discourses, these ways of thinking about Alaska, and both kind of structure how European powers dealt with Alaska and thus dealt with Alaska Native peoples.